Hello again. Welcome to Chapter 5 on learning. And we're going to look at a couple of different ways that we learn. Most specifically, we're going to look at classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and cognitive learning. When we think of learning, we think of acquiring new skills, acquiring new knowledge, new information, and that's part of the story. But there are so many ways that we learn, and I'm not talking about learning style here. I'm talking about things that we may be consciously aware of and may not be consciously aware of that influence our learning or our change of behavior. So what I want to start off with is actually talking about what psychologists mean by learning, how we define it. Then I want to get into, in this particular module anyways, classical conditioning. In the second module, we'll talk about operant conditioning. So today our focus, though, will be on classical conditioning in Module A. So, as I said, let's talk about learning. What is it? What do psychologists consider learning? The first thing you need to know is that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or ability to change your behavior, knowledge, capability, or attitude that is acquired through experience. So in other words, what's happening is that we are exposed to something, we either observe it, we take it in, we do something with it, and we change our behavior as a result. So when we're talking about learning as relatively permanent, it's that ability to get something out of what we learn that we can use and apply somewhere else. It's that ability to take a new piece of knowledge or a new piece of activity and being able to say, I want to adopt this as a behavior, it's part of my behavior. But it's not always about those consciously aware changes in behavior. Sometimes it's related more to a reflex or other attitude. Now, so just to sort of add to this, learning is not just something that's going to happen naturally anyways. So for instance, we don't say that a young boy learns to have a deep voice at puberty. It's something that happens. So he's not learned to speak like a man. He has acquired it naturally as a result of the hormonal changes that occur at adolescence. So I just want you to understand that distinction, that we can't call that learning. We can only call those things that have made a change in us that we are aware of, that is acquired through experience. So let's talk about classical conditioning. And whenever we think of classical conditioning, the first person that we should be thinking about is Ivan Pavlov. And some of you may have heard of Pavlov's dogs. I'm going to explain that sort of in the next slide. But just at this point, all you need to know is Ivan Pavlov did some experiments to try and understand how people and animals learn. And he called his experiments classical conditioning. Basically, he said that we form an association between one stimulus or thing and another. And as a result, we have learned this way of reacting to things. And we're going to look a little bit more later about how we can sort of apply that to our day-to-day living. But at this point, think of it as those activities that we want to shape by associating. And as I think I mentioned this when we were talking about substance abuse, that sometimes people have learned to associate a drug with a good feeling, and so they are motivated to continue taking it. This is a form of classical conditioning. It's that feeling, it's more of a reflex kind of thing. It's not something that you can tangibly say, I learned this because of this. It's more of the association is paired so many times that we eventually say, this goes together. We'll talk about this a bit more in a second. But I want to get some terms related to classical conditioning in your understanding so that we can move forward and talk about how to apply classical conditioning and how classical conditioning has been applied in our day-to-day life. Okay, so let's talk about Pavlov's experiments with dogs. What happens when a dog is presented with food? It's a natural reaction that the dog will start salivating or get juices in its mouth. It can happen to us too. It's basically something that we don't think about. It's a reflex. It just is a naturally occurring thing. It's hot, we sweat. It's cold, we shiver. We don't necessarily consciously think, oh, I'm cold, I'm going to start shivering. No, you probably start shivering and then realize it's because of the cold. Or you start sweating and you realize it's because it's so hot out. These are the kinds of things that Pavlov wanted to see if he could change that response in some way or elicit that response just by doing some activities that the dog starts to see it with. So he first called the fact that the dog salivates a reflex. But he wanted to look at what gets that salivation reflex happening. Is it just because they're hungry, or is it because of something else? And so the first thing he did was he would present food to them. He called this the unconditioned stimulus, because food, as he noticed, naturally produces this unconditioned response of salivation. So here's two terms that you have to understand. The unconditioned stimulus, that thing that is naturally going to produce a particular response. So if I go back to my example with people, heat naturally produces sweating. Okay? So heat, the unconditioned stimulus, naturally produces the unconditioned response of sweating. Now, can we get this dog to react this way without actually presenting food? It took some time, but this was a question that Pavlov asked in his experiment. So the next thing he tried was to have a neutral stimulus. In this picture, you see a tuning fork, but it could be a bell, it could be any kind of noise. If you think about your own dogs and cats, for those of you who have dogs, it may be the sound of you opening the can with a can opener. It may be opening a bag, and the dog may come running expecting food, even if that bag that you're opening is actually a bag of rice and not his or her food, because they've learned to associate that neutral stimulus of you opening a bag with the possibility of food. Now, if there's no food, the first time that you do this, you just sort of do this, make this noise, but there's no food, the dog's not going to salivate, he's not going to react. We call that the neutral stimulus, this tone. This tone means nothing until you start pairing it with something. So it's a neutral stimulus until there is something paired with it. Let me explain this a little bit further. The neutral stimulus now is paired with food, and it's at the same time, okay? So that bell rings, the food is on the table or the plate, and the dog starts to salivate, that unconditioned response. But eventually, the dog starts to associate that neutral stimulus as a conditioned stimulus. In other words, because Pavlov, in his experiments, did this so many times, the dog said, "Oh, there's that bell. That means food." Your dog may be thinking, "Oh, there's that drawer of mine opening. That means food." Just as an aside, I have a dog and I keep her food all in a bottom drawer in the kitchen, large deep drawer. And as soon as I open it, she comes running thinking that she's going to get something. It's a treat, even if I'm just getting like a bag out of there to take her for a walk. She's learned to associate that particular, and it's interesting because it's at the bottom of a bunch of drawers that I use on a regular basis, but those other drawers don't elicit the same response, just that one drawer. So there's a sound of that particular drawer that she has learned over time to associate with food. So eventually, when that dog started to associate that conditioned response, or conditioned stimulus of noise, the bell, the tone, whatever you want to call it, with food, they would have a conditioned response of salivation, even if there was no food. Now, eventually that would be extinct, but we'll talk about that a little bit when we move on to the next slide. But at this point, I want you to understand these terms, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus is something that is naturally going to make a person, an animal, react in a certain way. In the case of this example, food in the mouth is going to produce salivation. It's expected. But all of a sudden you introduce a neutral stimulus, something that's meaningless, it hasn't been associated with anything, and you're not going to get any salivation at first, but if you keep pairing that at the same time, that neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus of food, they're going to have the unconditioned response. And once they're conditioned, that tone will become the conditioned stimulus, and the response will become conditioned as well. So let's talk about a few related terms that are important to understand related to this notion of stimulus response or classical conditioning. Extinction does occur, but it takes time. So if you stop giving food every time you have a bell, the dog's going to realize, oh, that bell's not related to food anymore. I'm not getting anything. And they'll stop coming. They won't run anymore. They won't respond anymore. But of course, you can get that back again. It will be at a weaker level, but that spontaneous recovery occurs if that conditioned stimulus of the bell paired with the meat is presented, then that conditioned response of salivation reappears. It's much weaker. That's one thing you'd have to understand. It takes more training to get that animal to react in the same way to that particular stimulus. Eventually, I will be posting a sort of an overview of all these terms that you can sort of compare and contrast this particular mode of learning with other modes of learning. But the important thing to remember for classical conditioning is that it is only valid for reflex and emotional responses. It's not something that we can purposefully or voluntarily choose. I'll give you another example with my dog. When she was a puppy, we wanted to train her to go to the washroom outside. She had a couple of accidents, but not a lot. Because what we did is we gave her little pieces of chicken wiener every time she went outside to do her business. And so she associated that chicken wiener with going to the washroom outside. She didn't get it inside if she made the mistake. She only got it when she went outside. And it was quite funny to watch her, actually, because she would be turning her head as she was doing her business, watching to see if you actually had a piece of chicken's wiener in your hand ready to give her when she was finished. Another term related to this is generalization. Now, generalization occurs because something similar generates the same response. So if we go back to Pavlov's experiments, he could use a different, slightly different tone, but because it is a musical tone or because it's a bell-like tone, there is that similar reaction of salivation or a conditioned response when that tone, that music, that bell, whatever it is paired with meat. And that's the key thing to remember as well, that they have to be paired at the same time for the animal or the person to make that association, to learn that association. Okay, so this is the end of Module A. In Module B, we're going to look at a different form of learning, operant conditioning. Before we get to operant conditioning, I want to talk a little bit about some practical applications of classical conditioning, because I want to make sure that you really fully understand this. That there's a lot of new terms that you've probably never heard before, and it's important that you understand them. So Module A, Part 2, will be about how we can apply these terms to our daily life, to ourselves. And I've talked about the one with the drugs and the association with that euphoric or good feeling. But let's talk about some more in the next module.